July 14, 1942. Near Voronezh, western Russia. The morning air trembled with heat and tension. Across the horizon, the endless steppe stretched like a furnace, scorched by weeks of shellfire. Smoke clung to the earth, twisting upward in thin, dark ribbons that caught the early light. German armored columns crawled forward, Panzer IVs and half-tracks grinding across dirt roads, their tracks crushing broken wheat stalks and the remnants of Soviet defenses. Captain Hans Bauer of the Wehrmacht's 9th Panzer Division raised his field glasses. He could see the Soviet lines collapsing, men running, silhouettes barely visible through the haze. Another day, another Soviet retreat. The offensive toward Stalingrad seemed unstoppable. But something felt different this morning. The air was too still. Too quiet. Suddenly, a distant whine. It began low, like the moan of a storm over the plains, and grew rapidly into a high-pitched scream. The German soldiers froze. Heads turned toward the tree line where the sound seemed to originate. Then, thunder. A wall of flame erupted from beyond the horizon. Dozens of streaking comets cut through the sky, leaving behind trails of smoke and fire. A second later came the sound, a roaring, unearthly howl that drowned out every other noise on the battlefield. The rockets slammed into the German positions with terrifying force, exploding in rapid succession. The ground shook violently. Men were thrown into the air. Vehicles flipped over. The Panzer's steel hulls rang like bells as shrapnel tore through armor plating. Bauer hit the ground, clutching his helmet as dirt and debris rained down. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't mortars. It was something else, something entirely new. Over the horizon, concealed in the woods, Soviet trucks were lined up nose to tail. Each one mounted with rails of gleaming metal, BM-13 rocket launchers, mounted on Studebaker trucks supplied by the Americans. But this was no American design. This was the Soviet Union's newest weapon, the BM-13 Katyusha. The crews worked with machine-like speed. 8 men per truck, reloading as smoke from the first salvo drifted away. The commander barked coordinates, engines roared, another volley fired. Dozens of rockets screamed into the sky again, a symphony of destruction. From a nearby trench, Lieutenant Viktor Orlov, commander of a Katyusha battery, watched the devastation unfold through his binoculars. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the shockwave that still rippled through the ground. Behind him, mechanics scrambled to cool the rocket rails with buckets of water, smoke rising from the metal. The men were exhausted, they'd been awake for 36 hours straight, but none complained. They knew what this moment meant. For the first time in months, the Germans were falling back. The rockets didn't just destroy tanks, they obliterated morale. Survivors stumbled out of craters, dazed, ears ringing, eyes wide with disbelief. Some screamed about the Stalingrad, Stalin's organ, named for the eerie, organ-like wail the rockets made before impact. By nightfall, reconnaissance planes confirmed it, the German advance near Voronezh had halted. Entire battalions were in disarray. And somewhere, in a field tent lit by a dim lantern, Soviet engineers began to realize what they had unleashed, a weapon of terror, precision, and speed. A weapon that would soon become the voice of Soviet revenge. June 1941. Moscow, Soviet Union. The smell of oil, metal, and sweat hung heavy inside Factory No. 70, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Moscow. Inside, under the hum of generators and the pounding rhythm of hammers, a team of engineers worked through the night. They were not soldiers, but their work was every bit as vital as the men on the front. At the center of it all stood engineer Andrei Kostikov, head of a small design bureau under the People's Commissariat for Armaments. His uniform was plain, his hair slicked back with grease and fatigue. In his hand he held a single steel tube, one of dozens laid out across a workbench. "Comrades," he said quietly, glancing at the men and women gathered around. "If this works, it will change everything. The weapon was simple in theory, unguided rockets mounted on rails and fired in rapid succession. But simplicity was its genius. Unlike conventional artillery, it didn't require heavy gun barrels or long reload times. A battery could launch a full salvo and relocate before the enemy even knew where the fire had come from. The project had been shrouded in secrecy since its conception. The engineers called it the BM-13, but the soldiers who would soon wield it gave it a more affectionate name, Katyusha, after a popular wartime song about a girl waiting for her lover at the front. In the corridors of Soviet command, however, there were doubts. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, always a pragmatist, worried that the weapon was too unpredictable. Early tests had been catastrophic, rockets exploding prematurely, rails misfiring, and entire test ranges catching fire. But Stalin was desperate. The German invasion, Operation Barbarossa, had torn through Soviet lines with unimaginable speed. Cities were burning. The Red Army was retreating. They needed something to strike fear into the enemy, something fast, mobile, and devastating. So in July 1941, the order came down: deploy the Katyusha. The first unit was the Experimental Rocket Artillery Battery, commanded by Captain Ivan Flyarov. 32 launchers, loaded onto ZIS-6 trucks, painted in dull olive to blend with the landscape. Their first mission, the small town of Orsha, in Belarus. At dawn, Flyarov's men positioned their trucks in a clearing overlooking the railway junction. German reinforcements were moving through the town, unaware that the Soviet line had hidden teeth waiting in the forest. Flyarov gave the order. The first salvo roared into the sky, leaving trails of smoke that twisted like white serpents above the trees. Seconds later, the rockets struck. The explosions came in waves, thunderous, overlapping, deafening. Within moments, the German column was obliterated. Ammunition cars ignited, tanks flipped, soldiers scattered in panic. Witnesses said the entire town burned in less than 10 minutes. For the first time in the war, the Soviets had not only stopped a German advance, they had shattered it. When reports reached Moscow, Stalin himself demanded to see the weapon in person. He was told of the noise, the speed, the devastation. A smile crossed his face. "Let the fascists hear her song," he reportedly said. From that day on, the Katyusha was no longer a prototype. It was a symbol. A symbol of Soviet defiance, and of vengeance. As production ramped up, new variants appeared: the BM-8, BM-31, mounted on everything from trucks to tanks to railcars. Hundreds of launchers rolled out each month from makeshift factories across the Ural Mountains. But what truly made the Katyusha feared wasn't its accuracy or design, it was psychological warfare. Every time the rocket screamed through the air, soldiers froze. The haunting, organ-like howl became synonymous with annihilation. The Germans gave it the nickname Stalinorgel, Stalin's organ, because of the unholy sound it produced before it struck. And as 1942 dawned, the Red Army began to plan a massive counteroffensive. The Katyusha would lead the charge, not as a secret weapon anymore, but as the voice of the Eastern Front. September 13, 1942. Stalingrad, Soviet Union. The city was burning. Smoke rose from every block, blackening the Volga skyline. The sound of artillery was constant, an unending rhythm of destruction that seemed to shake the bones of the earth. Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a wasteland of fire and twisted steel. On the eastern bank of the Volga, hidden among camouflaged brush and the skeletons of bombed-out warehouses, rows of Katyusha launchers waited silently. Their crews were motionless, listening to the distant thunder of German tanks grinding through the rubble. Lieutenant Viktor Orlov crouched behind a Studebaker truck, wiping grime from his hands. His face was gaunt, streaked with soot. He'd been fighting for 90 days with little rest. The men of his battery were veterans now, they'd seen entire divisions erased in seconds, and they carried that knowledge like a curse. Orlov, a runner, shouted over the noise. "Headquarters says, target confirmed, German armor crossing Red October factory district. Orlov nodded grimly. Tell them the choir's ready to sing. He climbed onto the truck, scanning the horizon. Through the haze, faint glimmers of steel reflected the morning light, Panzer IVs, Stugs, and half-tracks advancing in a tight column toward the shattered factories. German infantry followed close behind, believing the Soviets were retreating. They didn't know what waited for them. Orlov raised a red signal flare. The crews tensed. Each truck mounted 16 launch rails, each loaded with rockets that hissed faintly in the heat. On my command. He counted under his breath. 3, 2, 1. The first salvo screamed into the sky. The roar was deafening. Dozens of fire trails arched overhead, curving downward toward the city's heart. For a fraction of a second, there was silence, then impact. The factory district vanished in a storm of explosions. Flames leapt 50 feet into the air. The shockwave shattered glass all the way to the Volga. The Germans scattered, tanks spun in confusion, infantry dove for cover. Within minutes, the entire column was engulfed. Orlov's men reloaded with mechanical precision. They'd practiced this ritual countless times, loading, aiming, firing, retreating, each movement fueled by adrenaline and revenge. The Katyushas fired again and again, the sky alive with the streaking glow of destruction. By the time the smoke cleared, the German assault was gone. Only smoldering wrecks and the echo of distant cries remained. But Stalingrad was no victory yet. Across the city, block by block, house by house, the battle raged on. Snipers in the ruins, machine guns in stairwells, and mortar fire that never stopped. The Katyusha batteries became the Soviets' thunderous backbone, firing in support of infantry counterattacks, breaking up German concentrations, and striking fear into enemy hearts. Captured German soldiers later described the sound as the voice of death itself. They said it came without warning, a rising wail that froze your blood before the blast even hit. To the Soviet soldiers, though, that sound was salvation. It meant their side still had strength. It meant they could fight another day. In Moscow, reports of the Katyusha's success flooded the Kremlin. Stalin ordered more built. Production plants across the Urals worked around the clock, their chimneys belching smoke like volcanoes. By winter, thousands of launchers rolled eastward by rail, each painted with a red star and a woman's name, Nina, Olga, Tatiana, and Katyusha. As snow began to fall on the ruins of Stalingrad, Orlov's battery received its final order, relocate south. The Germans were being encircled. Operation Uranus had begun. What no one realized yet was that this campaign, powered by tanks, soldiers, and the haunting chorus of Katyushas, would mark the turning point of the entire Eastern Front. The tide was beginning to turn. November 19, 1942. Outside Kalak-on-Don, west of Stalingrad. The steppe was silent, too silent. A thick layer of frost blanketed the ground, glittering faintly under a pale sunrise. Soviet soldiers crouched in trenches, breath visible in the icy air, waiting for a signal that would ignite the largest counteroffensive the Red Army had ever launched. Lieutenant Viktor Orlov's Katyusha battery sat hidden behind a ridge. The trucks were camouflaged with branches and snow-covered tarps, their launch rails gleaming faintly in the cold light. Crews checked circuits, adjusted elevation angles, and whispered final prayers. Across the radio, a single phrase crackled through the static. Za Rodinu. Za Stalina. For the motherland. For Stalin. The operation had begun. At exactly 7:20 hours, the first Soviet artillery salvo screamed through the sky. Thousands of guns opened up in unison, shaking the frozen ground. The horizon glowed red with explosions. But above all that thunder, one sound pierced through, the high-pitched howl of hundreds of Katyushas firing simultaneously. It was as if the heavens themselves had opened. Dozens of rocket trails arced through the dawn, cutting bright paths across the sky. Within seconds, the German and Romanian positions along the Don River vanished under a wall of flame and smoke. The earth convulsed, trees splintered, and trenches disappeared. In the chaos, German radio operators screamed into their headsets. Communications broke down entirely. The sound, that unholy wail, came again and again, followed by concussive blasts that rolled across the steppe like thunderclaps. To the Soviet infantry advancing behind the barrage, it was a symphony of vengeance. They ran forward under the cover of fire, rifles clenched, shouting over the roar. When they reached the enemy lines, they found nothing left but scorched earth and dazed survivors clutching their ears, eyes wide with terror. Orlov watched from his position on the ridge, binoculars trembling slightly in his hands. Again, he shouted. His men reloaded with numb efficiency. The next salvo screamed outward, the noise drowning everything. His face reflected the glow of fire as the second wave tore into the horizon. By nightfall, the Soviet pincers from north and south were closing in. Entire Axis divisions, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, crumbled under the assault. Within 3 days, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus was completely encircled in Stalingrad. The once invincible Wehrmacht was trapped, a city of ruins now their cage. Captured German diaries spoke of the same nightmare. The rockets come first, always the same sound, the shrieking organ of Stalin. Then nothing but fire. Soviet propaganda seized on that terror. Posters showed rockets streaking toward the sky under the words, "The Katyusha sings, the fascists burn." From the factories of the Urals to the front lines of Stalingrad, production and morale soared. Soviet women and men built launchers day and night, knowing each one might tip the balance of the war. By January 1943, as temperatures plunged below -30, the last German strongholds inside Stalingrad began to surrender. The once proud divisions that had stormed across Europe now marched into captivity, gaunt, frozen, defeated. And in every Soviet regiment that participated, from tank crews to riflemen, there was one sound they would never forget, the banshee cry of the Katyusha that had heralded their vengeance. In the months that followed, the Red Army began to push westward. The Katyusha rode with them, mounted on trucks, tanks, and trains, a mobile storm that preceded every advance. From the snows of Kursk to the plains of Belarus, its voice became the signal of Soviet resurgence. The weapon born in secrecy and desperation had become the instrument of victory. But with its growing fame came a new challenge: how to control, refine, and multiply its devastating power. And deep within Soviet laboratories and field workshops, new innovations were already in motion. Spring 1943. Chelyabinsk, Soviet Union, the Stalingrad industrial complex. The war was still raging, but here, far behind the front lines, the battle sounded different. It was the metallic rhythm of progress, furnaces roaring, presses hammering, and the steady hum of conveyor belts rolling out machines of war. The city of Chelyabinsk had been transformed into an industrial fortress. In one of its secret workshops, under the red banner of the People's Commissariat for Armaments, engineers gathered around a test rack where a new rocket motor hissed faintly. Standing at the center was Andrei Kostikov, the same man who had overseen the first BM-13 designs 2 years before. But now, the project had outgrown its humble beginnings. Kostikov's hair had turned gray. His hands trembled from exhaustion. But his eyes, sharp and determined, still burned with the same vision that had fueled the Katyusha's creation. "We made the enemy fear our sound," he told his team, gesturing toward the new prototype. "Now, we'll make them fear our reach." The BM-13 had proven itself a battlefield legend, but it had weaknesses: limited accuracy, small payloads, and a range that forced the launchers dangerously close to the front. Kostikov's new designs aimed to fix that. One table was covered in blueprints labeled BM-31-12, a larger, deadlier version capable of firing heavier M31 rockets with nearly twice the explosive power. Another corner held early sketches for BM-8 launchers mounted on T-60 light tank chassis, designed for mobility under fire. These were not just weapons, they were evolving instruments of total war. Back on the front, Lieutenant Viktor Orlov's battery was re-equipped with the new BM-31 systems by mid-1943. His men stared in awe as the fresh vehicles rolled into camp, their massive rails gleaming under the sun. Each rocket was nearly 2 meters long and packed with over 20 kilograms of explosives. Orlov ran his hand along one of the launch rails, whistling softly. "If the old ones sang," he muttered, "these will scream." Their first test came soon after, the Battle of Kursk, July 1943. It was the largest tank battle in history, and the Katyusha would once again lead the Soviet storm. As German panzers advanced across the fields near Prokhorovka, Soviet artillery observers relayed coordinates to Orlov's unit. The sky was clear, the ground trembling under the weight of thousands of armored vehicles. Fire! The BM-31s unleashed their fury. The new rockets flew farther and struck harder, detonating in a line of blinding flame that tore through German tank formations. Infantry were shredded by shockwaves that rippled across the fields. Even hardened SS divisions faltered under the relentless barrage. When the firing ceased, Orlov lowered his binoculars. The fields were burning, metal twisted, men scattering, smoke rising in pillars. "That's for Stalingrad," he whispered. The reports from Kursk were staggering. The BM-31's heavier warheads had shattered enemy defensive lines in minutes. Soviet High Command demanded mass production. Within weeks, more variants followed, the BM-13N, the BM-8-24, and even train-mounted rocket launchers capable of firing from mobile platforms across hundreds of kilometers. The Katyusha Division, once an experimental artillery detachment, was now an entire branch of the Red Army. Thousands of trucks, each armed with a storm. But beyond the raw firepower, the weapon had become something deeper, a symbol of Soviet identity. Soldiers painted slogans across the launchers. "For Mother Russia." "For Stalingrad." "For those who never returned." Every time the rockets screamed skyward, they carried not just explosives, but vengeance, memory, and pride. By late 1943, Soviet forces were pushing the Germans west, liberating cities that had once fallen under the shadow of the swastika. Wherever the Red Army advanced, the Katyusha's haunting melody echoed before them, a grim herald of Soviet might. Still, for men like Viktor Orlov, the sound that once meant hope had turned into something else, a ghostly reminder of what they'd lost. He would sometimes wake in the night to phantom echoes of the rockets, their screams etched into his dreams. The war was turning in their favor, but every victory came at a cost. And as 1944 approached, the Katyusha would be called upon once more, to carry that thunder all the way to Berlin. January 1945. East Prussia, near Königsberg. The air was sharp and brittle with winter. Frost clung to every wire, every branch, every barrel of every Soviet gun pointed west. The offensive that would end the war had begun, Operation Vistula Oder, the Red Army's final thrust toward Berlin. The once invincible Wehrmacht was now a battered shell, retreating through the frozen fields of East Prussia. But still they fought, desperate, cornered, and vicious. Every road, every forest, every ruined village became a fortress. Lieutenant Viktor Orlov stood beside his Katyusha battery, his breath turning to steam in the cold air. The launchers were lined up along a ridge overlooking the snow-covered plains. Beyond them, faint flashes marked German artillery positions firing sporadically. "Range 12 kilometers," his observer called out. "Target, Königsberg defensive line, grid 14B." Orlov adjusted his gloves, his fingers numb. "Load all rails. Fire on my mark." The men moved quickly, working in silence. Each rocket slid into place with a metallic clank. The trucks hummed softly, engines idling under white camouflage nets. Orlov raised his arm. Za Moskvu. Za Stalingrad. Za Vsek, Topal. For Moscow. For Stalingrad. For all who fell. He dropped his arm. The night exploded. Dozens of rockets tore into the sky, their trails lighting the darkness like fiery ribbons. The noise was deafening, a howling crescendo that seemed to rip open the heavens themselves. The Katyusha's roar rolled across the frozen plains, echoing off the ruins of East Prussia like the laughter of ghosts. When the rocket struck, the ground convulsed. German bunkers disintegrated, tanks were tossed like toys, and entire lines vanished beneath plumes of smoke and flame. Soviet infantry poured forward immediately behind the barrage, bayonets gleaming, faces grim. For the Germans, it was the same nightmare replayed, the same terrible music that had haunted them since Stalingrad. To many, the sound of the Katyusha was the sound of defeat. By February, Königsberg had fallen. The Red Army continued west, through Poland, across the Oder River. Each city liberated carried scars, burned walls, empty streets, shattered homes. And behind those ruins, the echo of the Katyusha followed like a relentless drumbeat. Orlov's battery, now veterans of nearly every major front, was reassigned to the 1st Belarusian Front, under Marshal Zhukov, in preparation for the assault on Berlin. April 16, 1945. Seelow Heights. It was the last major battle before Berlin itself, and the largest artillery bombardment of the entire war. More than 40,000 guns and rocket launchers lined the eastern bank of the Oder River. The sky was black with smoke even before the first attack began. At 3 o'clock hours, the order came, open fire. The Katyushas answered in unison, thousands of rockets launching in cascading waves. The horizon became a wall of fire. The thunder rolled on for hours, drowning out everything else. German lines disintegrated under the sheer weight of destruction. Even hardened Soviet soldiers stood in stunned silence between reloads, watching the world burn before them. The barrage lasted nearly an entire day, paving the way for Zhukov's final push into Berlin. Orlov's men were among the first to cross the Seelow Heights. They advanced behind their own rockets, moving through smoke and rubble, step by step, toward the city that had started it all. When they reached Berlin's outskirts, the sky was a haze of smoke and flame. Rockets continued to fall deep into the city, bursting among the ruins of streets that had once carried Nazi parades. Every blast echoed like vengeance long overdue. By May 2, 1945, Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was over. In the aftermath, as Soviet troops raised the red flag over the Reichstag, the Katyusha trucks that had carried the Soviet thunder for 4 relentless years sat silent, their rails scorched, their paint blistered by fire and winter. Lieutenant Viktor Orlov walked among them, running his hand along the cold metal. Around him, soldiers were cheering, crying, laughing, but he simply stared eastward. Toward home. The weapon that had once saved his army had also defined his war. Its song, terrifying, beautiful, unforgettable, had followed him from Moscow's ashes to Berlin's ruins. He lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and whispered, "Sleep now, Katyusha. You've sung enough." The wind carried the smoke away across the quiet fields of Germany. The thunder was over. But the legend of the Katyusha, the secret Soviet weapon that had changed the Eastern Front, would echo forever through the pages of history.